Welcome to Module 1 of Making the Difference for Disadvantaged Pupils. Welcome to everyone from Rotherham Schools. We'll just do quick introductions before we start. My name's John Coates. I work at Notre Dame High School in Sheffield. I'm Director of Hallam Teaching School. Notre Dame also holds the designation of the Sheffield Associate Research School. We're part of the National Research School Network, and so I'm Director of the Sheffield Associate Research School also. Alistair?
And hello, and I'm Alistair Gittner. My current title is the Research Lead here at the Sheffield Associate Research School. My job involves engaging teachers with research evidence with a view to helping with school improvement.
Okay, so just this slide covers very briefly what we're hoping for to be the outcomes of today's module. We want you to leave at the end of this session knowing what's to be expected and what you'll gain from completing the programme. It's really important for us that you end up with a good understanding of the context of educational disadvantage, both nationally and locally, and that also goes as far as within your own school. Would like to give you an opportunity to do some baselining of the key areas related to pupil premium in your school, so that we've got a real tight focus on monitoring and evaluation from the outset. And really importantly, we want to start talking about what we need in place, what conditions we need in place if we're going to successfully implement a pupil premium strategy in your school. So there'll be a bit of implementation towards the end of this session as well. So the formal aims of the programme, this project, this collaborative work between ROSIS and the Sheffield Associate Research School. As you know, it's part funded by the Education Endowment Foundation. The formal aims of the programme in its entirety are to improve pupil outcomes in Rotherham. And we're running this modular course over the next 2 terms. Now, we're not pretending that by the end of June, July 2022, we will see improvements in pupil outcomes in Rotherham directly as a result of this programme. Those improvements and outcomes we would anticipate would come later. But what we do hope we will be in a position of by July is that we will have developed the confidence and effectiveness of school leaders in Rotherham to both diagnose the needs in their schools and also that increased confidence and effectiveness in implementing a strategy in their schools that's evidence informed. So as I say, it's running across spring and summer terms 2022. It's a modular programme, and the next slide outlines how those modules work. Who's it for? We'll perhaps say a bit more about this later too, but it's designed for senior leaders in schools, and you know what, this is important. It's senior leaders in schools who've both got the capacity to engage fully with the programme and really also the clout, the authority to effect change within their organisations. And when Alistair talks a little bit about implementation right at the end, you'll realise the importance of the right people in schools being on the programme. If you're here today, you won't have paid anything to be here today. It's free. As I say, it is a jointly funded programme by the Education Endowment Foundation and ROSIS, so a really exciting collaboration. So what does the programme look like? If you're at the launch event, you will have seen this slide before, but I think it's worth going through again, just so that we're all got the same understanding of what's involved. There are 8 modules, and we've set this up so that we're alternating between self-study modules. So this is the first of the self-study modules, and live modules. They're the green ones, and those live modules will be delivered remotely. What we're trying to do is put this programme on in such a way that we're removing as many barriers as possible to schools engaging with it. So we're not asking you to travel great distances, and we're also trying to give you as much flexibility as possible about when you're engaging with the different modules. You'll see also as we go through these modules that there are gap tasks that we're asking you to undertake in between modules. Hopefully not too onerous, hopefully useful in the context of addressing disadvantage in your school. Alongside the core programme that all schools will be engaging with, a number of schools, approximately 10, will be receiving some enhanced support alongside this, and that will constitute 2 half-day visits The first will be, well, they'll both be during the summer term, but the first visit will be what we're calling an exploring disadvantage visit. It's not a pupil premium review, it's an exploring disadvantage visit. That's with a system leader coming into your school and exploring the barriers to disadvantage in your school and starting that conversation about how to address those. Those schools will also receive a follow-on support visit during the summer term. As I said at the launch event, though, what we don't want to do is just come in and, inverted commas, do CPD. What we want to do is make sure that we're also growing capacity in Rotherham to support this sort of work in the future. So alongside this, we're providing some additional training for a group of system leaders. And those system leaders will accompany Sheffield system leaders on the exploring disadvantage visits, and then we'll be in a position where they then do their own exploring disadvantage support visit. But the idea then is that next academic year, Rotherham has got a team of people who feel confident and equipped to support schools with visits to support disadvantage. It's important to say that the system leaders who will be taking part in this extra training and will be assisting with the exploring disadvantage visits, those system leaders are also attending all of the modules. So, you know, you are also very welcome on the core program. And in fact, I know that there are some system leaders who are here in two capacities. One, because their school is engaging with the core program, but also they're providing additional capacity to the program as a system leader to support with support visits. So that's the outline of the program.
So, good afternoon again. With school improvements and all this sort of the work in terms of improving outcomes for disadvantaged students, this is not going to happen in these sessions. School improvements and then the work with the disadvantaged will happen when you go back to your school, when you start working with your colleagues, and when you start making the difference with your particular students. And so on here we have some in-school descriptors that is taken from the EEF's Pupil Premium Gap guidance booklet. This is a booklet that's available on the Padlet, which we will which you set up and give you access to, and contains all the documents and recordings of these video sessions for you to be able to study at your leisure. And so just want you to spend a few moments, you might want to pause the video and look through these and see how many of these would apply to your school. If for any reason you feel that you're not sure about whether this applies to your school, this again goes back to what John was saying a few moments ago. It's really important that whoever's helping you with this course or is involved with this course has the capacity and the authority to make sort of changes, and so they will the people who will know the answers to these questions. It's important that you familiarize yourself with the EEF's guidance on pupil premium, because this also fits in with the tiered approach that we need to take when we're considering improvements with pupil premium and when we're working with disadvantaged students, and the documentation and reports that you have to make. Moving on, the guidance reports that come from the EEF are now directly linking to one of the most important guidance reports, which is about implementation. And you can see that this graphic here is trying to demonstrate that the pupil premium strategy is written right through with implementation. So that whatever we decide we're going to do, or whatever you decide you're going to do within your schools, the important thing is that we're thinking about implementation and taking guidance from the implementation strategy into the implementation guidance report, please, to help you with your strategy. And so the two are linked, and we're going to look at how you can consider this and how you're also going to consider evaluation of whatever you've decided to do at the end. So the implementation guidance report has this diagram fairly early on, and this shows us that implementation is a cycle. it's not to be thought of as a one-off event. And there are sections and recommendations as part of that, and we can see that there are 4: the exploring, the preparing, the delivering, and the sustaining. And when we look through the guidance report, the explore section is the one that we're going to spend the most time on. This is the one where we're identifying what it is that we can change, what's amenable to a change, and whether that fits in with our context. And you can see how these 4 sections will fit in with the modules. And this is a standard diagram that we use from the Research School Network. And so the actual number of modules may change slightly, but you can see that the majority of the modules that we're going to be looking at fit in with this module, the recommendation 1 regarding explore. And that's the thing that we're going to spend the time on over the early modules, finding out what it is in your context that is going to make the difference with disadvantaged students. The other things, the later things, the preparing and the actual delivering, you'll see that those are later on. And in the module 9 is only going to happen with the people who are on the enhanced program.
So in this section of the training, we're going to be spending a bit of time looking at both the national context for disadvantaged pupils and some of the more local context. So this slide, I suppose there's some good news and bad news on this slide. The bad news is the diagram on the left. And that diagram is taken from a report, Closing the Gap, Trends in Educational Attainment and Disadvantage, Educational Policy Institute back in 2017. So it's 4 years old, but the numbers haven't really changed. If anything, we know they've widened during the pandemic. And it is depressing. It's saying that on an average basis across the country, by the time students arrive in school, disadvantaged students are already at a 4-month disadvantage in terms of academic outcomes. And we'll look at some of the reasons for why that gap is already there when they start school, but that gap just widens as they go through school. By the time they reach the end of secondary school, disadvantaged students are typically 19 months behind their non-disadvantaged peers. Stop and think about that. That's 18 months. It's over 18 months. It's over 1.5 years behind their non-disadvantaged peers. And of course, none of us want it to be that way. And in fact, that's why the Education Endowment Foundation came into being. They're a charity, and their mission is to divorce the effect of socioeconomic disadvantage on educational outcomes. Now, I suppose the good news on this slide are the 3 quotes that were also taken from that report by the Educational Policy Institute. And I think the first quote's a powerful one, because sometimes we might be tempted to hold our hands up and say, well, we haven't got enough resource to fix this problem or do anything about it in our context. But actually, the findings of the EPI were that it doesn't appear to be a direct relationship. Whatever we might think, there doesn't appear to be a direct relationship between increasing school funding and increased pupil attainment. The increased pupil attainment comes about by using whatever resource you've got as effectively and as efficiently as possible. And by resource, we mean both financial and that human resource, which very often boils just down to time. The other good news is that, this can be done. There's almost 1 in 10 of all schools, 10% of primary schools and almost as many secondary schools, disadvantaged students are doing better than non-disadvantaged students, the average for non-disadvantaged pupils. And that tells us that it is possible for disadvantaged students to close the gap on their non-disadvantaged peers. And I think the last quote is also a really powerful one. And it basically just gives us yet another reason for wanting to do something to close this disadvantage gap. Because what it is basically saying that whatever we do for our disadvantaged pupils, it will also have a positive impact on the non-disadvantaged peers. We know that if we're trying to improve the quality of teaching and learning in schools, for example, that will improve the educational outcomes of all pupils, but it will have a disproportionate impact on the disadvantaged students. A slightly different graphic here. This is the disadvantaged gap at the end of primary school for free school meals pupils, measured in the proportion of a year. And you can see the good news is that that's been falling gradually since 2011. There hasn't been any comparative data collected that reliable data that collected. Key stage 2 assessments, for example, haven't happened over the last couple of years. But the studies that have been carried out suggest that gap has widened during the pandemic. Disadvantaged students have been less well equipped than their peers to cope with all the challenges around lockdown and remote learning. So we've talked about some gaps there, and what we want to do at this point is give you a chance, if you're looking at this on your own, to just spend a little bit of time individual reflection. If you're watching this with a colleague, to pause the video and have a discussion, but just to think about some of the factors that are baking in these educational outcome. Why are we getting these educational gaps in educational outcome for disadvantaged peers, students, and thinking about the journey of the students from early pregnancy all the way through to the end of secondary school. So I'll let you pause the video and have a think or have a conversation, and then we'll share some of the things that we think may be having an impact. Okay, I'm sure you will have thought of and/or discussed many of the things that we're going to show you now. So the list we're going to put up here is by no means exhaustive, and you will have some of these, and you will have other good suggestions as well. So if we think back at the very start of life, the pregnancies, it is more likely that disadvantaged students, that the parents of the disadvantaged student, the mother, it will have ill health during pregnancy, and that will affect the fetal development. It is more likely that the fetus will undergo stress in a disadvantaged or socioeconomically disadvantaged household, whereas it's more likely that there will be fewer health-related problems in a pregnancy in a better off from a financial point of view family. As the child develops, we go through early childhood. Disadvantaged students are likely to experience more adverse childhood experiences. Of course, ACEs are not they don't exclusively happen to disadvantaged students, but they are more likely to experience them. And also they are likely to be, their home circumstances is likely to mean that they're less well equipped to deal with those ACEs. And as we know, there's a correlation between the number of ACEs and educational outcomes. You could add in nutrition, quality nutrition at this stage of their development as well. Really important at that early stage development. So even by the time students arrive at school, students from socioeconomically disadvantaged households have got some of these, statistically, have got some of these disadvantages already baked in, and we need to be trying to overcome those to level the playing field again. As students go through school, I'm sure you talked about the home environment, the ability of a typical household to support with home learning, access to books, reading materials at home, the chances of a student having somewhere quiet at home to study as they get a bit older, stability of relationships in the household. All of these things will have an impact. As the students grow older, there perhaps might be more and more consideration given to catchment areas of schools. And of course, if you're in a more affluent household, you're in a position where you can make some choice about where your child goes to school. It might not be that you're paying them to send your child to a private school, but you're doing the same sort of thing by buying a more expensive house in a catchment area of school where outcomes are often higher. And although it shouldn't happen, students in disadvantaged students are more likely to live in areas where and attend schools who find it harder to recruit and retain experienced or specialist staff. And again, that will have an impact on educational outcomes. None of these things are right. We wouldn't want any of these things to happen, but they are the reality. And these are some of the factors, you will have thought of others, that result in these gaps by the time students leave school. One of the gaps we really want to talk about is that word gap. Mention access to reading materials in the last slide. There have been a number of studies done on this, both in England and in other countries. The study often quoted is that by the age of 3, students in economically disadvantaged households will know 500 words, whereas those in economically advantaged households will know over twice as many words. And you might think, well, okay, those that know fewer words will catch up over time. Yes, they will. But I think the next graphic really shows how that early gap has such a dramatic impact on gaps further on in their school careers. And it's due to something called the Matthew effect. And I didn't know why it was called the Matthew effect. I should have done work in a Catholic school, but Alistair filled me in. So it's called the Matthew effect because there is a parable in the Gospel of St. Matthew, which basically talks about those that are having talents being given more talents. And the reality is that the same is true in real life, that students that are poor readers have a slower rate of improvement, and those who are better readers have a faster rate of improving their reading. And you don't have to think too hard to realize that the orange line on the graph is talking about students who are still learning to read, whereas the green trajectory is very much students who are now reading to learn. And so closing that vocabulary gap, though, and really trying to address literacy gaps as early as possible is going to be a really powerful way of closing some disadvantaged gaps. We want to give you an opportunity, you don't have to, but we want to give you an opportunity to do a little bit of reading around the national data and a little bit into what the Rotherham context is. So there's a couple of links to reports here from the Educational Policy Institute. As I say, you don't have to engage with these. We are going to pull out some headlines in the next slides, but these are good documents, and I would encourage you to spend at least 5 or 10 minutes having a look through those. The links for these documents are, or in fact, the copies of the documents are on the Padlet for this module that we've sent you the link to, and where you've accessed this video from. So the EPI document, again, I think tells us what we already know, that the disadvantage gap grows as students progress through school. But it also shares some data about a different group of students, those who are persistently disadvantaged. And so whereas a disadvantaged student, for the purposes of this report, are those students who've been free school meals at any point in the last 6 years, the persistently disadvantaged students who are those who have spent the majority of their time at school on free school meals. They've got an 80% figure there for that. And not surprisingly, you can see that the gaps are even wider for this cohort of persistently disadvantaged students. But as just looking at those two graphs, I hope there's a question going around in your head along the lines of, I'm not sure I know what proportion of the pupil premium disadvantaged students at my school are persistently disadvantaged, and that's something I want to find out. That could lead to a useful line of inquiry. The report also talks about the pattern of gaps over time. So the pupil premium funding has been in place for a number of years now, and it's good news in general in that the gap has been closing at both early years, Key Stage 2, the gap's been closing, and again at Key Stage 4. What's a little bit concerning is that in more recent years, we've got these bars that are above the line, which means that actually in 2018-19, the gaps were widening. And we know as well that with the COVID disruption from the pandemic, that those gaps have widened further. So albeit that there's been some positive gap closing in the last 3 years, we know that the gaps have widened further. I wanted to draw your attention to this graphic that comes out of the EPI report as well, because it is encouraging us to think about other groups than just socioeconomically disadvantaged students. And the reason this is important, because there is in schools always an overlap between different cohorts of students. So this graphic, I think, captures and really brings home the huge gaps that exist in educational outcomes for disadvantaged, for different ethnic groups. You can see, for example, that this is Chinese. It's not that legible here. We've got some, the Chinese students at the end of secondary school are typically 2 years ahead of the national average. And at the other extreme, Gypsy Romas are typically, this is almost 3 years below national average. And when you look at the, the difference between being 3 years behind the average and 2 years ahead, well, that's 5 years. There's a 5-year educational gap between a typical average Chinese student in this country and a typical average Gypsy Roma student. And that does have a bearing on your pupil premium strategy, because there will be students within your pupil premium population who are of different ethnic groups, and being aware of the gaps that are likely to be there on account of the 2 different reasons, tells you something about those of your pupil premium cohort who are perhaps most vulnerable, and where you might want to prioritize some resource. In the same way, we know that there are gaps for SEND students. And again, there will be a big overlap between your SEND cohort and your pupil premium or your disadvantaged cohort. So again, I hope there are questions going around your mind, and you're thinking, actually, this is something I want to look at back with my school data. What are the overlaps between some of these groups of students? The EPI report mentions Rotherham in a number of places. We've put the page numbers there just to save you a bit of time if you're looking at the document. Just to pull out some of that for you. We've been a little bit naughty here because the EPI produces an annual report, and the quote here is actually from the 2019 report, not the 2021. This doesn't appear in the 2020 report, which means things are obviously a bit better. But I'll let you read that quote because it says something I think we all need to be aware of about English and maths outcomes in Rotherham for disadvantaged students. And just as a comparator, this is just an alphabetic comparison. If you want to look at the document, you can compare Rotherham with any other local authority you want to. You get a sense of the attainment in Rotherham for disadvantaged students compared with those in other authorities. This is the last bit of data we wanted to share with you from those links. And what this one does is effectively it ranks the disadvantage gap in all the local authorities. So if you're over at the right hand side of this ranking, you've got the lower gaps, the smallest gaps. And if you're over this side, you've got the highest gaps. And there's the green bar is Rotherham. You can see the top graph is early years. So in terms of the gaps at early years, Rotherham is around about national average, maybe the gap slightly wider than average. But you can see that as students progress through primary school and then secondary school, the disadvantage gap is wider compared to other local authorities. It gets wider compared to other local authorities. So that, again, that is something that I think you need to be aware of when you're thinking about the Rotherham context. I'm going to hand over to Alistair again at this point, and Alistair's going to look at things now from a school perspective. What's the context for your school in comparison to similar schools?
Okay, so you've had a chance to look at the data around the disadvantage gap nationally and in various different groups, and also you've started to have a look at the disadvantage gap in Rotherham. And so now it's time to start looking at perhaps the disadvantage gap in your own school and the performance of your own school compared to other schools. The one thing that's important to remember about this is that the disadvantage gap exists in all schools. And it doesn't matter whether a school is high achieving or whether it's in a Ofsted category. The gaps are often very similar between different schools in different groups. But it's worthwhile looking at your own school to see how it compares to similar schools. And the easiest way to do that is to go to the Family of Schools database from the EEF. And when you go in there, you can search for your school, and then it brings up various graphics to show how you compare to similar schools in similar contexts. And if this was a live website, when you hover over these bands, you can see the name of the school. In this particular case, this is a graphic for Notre Dame, and the dotted line indicates the average for similar schools, and in this case it's looking at Progress 8 scores for pupil premium. But you can change the data and have a good look to see how your school is comparing to your family of schools. And then we come to one of the activities that we want you to do before you come to the next session, and this is about existing beliefs and assumption sheet. And you can see that there's things to do with the pupil premium and school budget and the gaps and school leaders. And this is a good, just a sort of like state of the nation exercise. What's happening in your school regarding pupil premium? And if there's 2 of you or 3 of you on this course from one school, it's always worthwhile doing this kind of thing separately. So you do it on your own, and then you can compare and see how you feel between the 2 of you. No one's going to look at these other than yourself, and so there's no fear of any judgment in there. And so honesty in this case has got to be the best policy. So we've looked at the context, you know where your pupil premium students are doing in your school, and so we're starting to think about implementation and making changes. And we're going to return now to the implementation guidance report. All the guidance reports from the EEF are available from the Associate Research School. So if you contact us, we can provide hard copies for you. But they are available online, and if you search for them, you'll find electronic versions. And like all the good guidance reports, they're based on research evidence, and the EEF and the team that they've employed to create the guidance report comes up with a number of recommendations. And you can see here that there are 6. The first 4, 3, 4, and 5, sorry, the second 4, 3, 4, 5, and 6, we've already looked at before. And these are the different areas of the implementation: exploring, preparing, delivering, and sustain. But more importantly, in this particular guidance report, there are 2 overriding recommendations. One, we briefly mentioned earlier, that we must treat implementation as a process. We're not looking for one-off events to launch a new pupil premium strategy or anything. We're looking at a sort of continual assessment and change process. And then the second one is that we need to create a leadership environment and school climate that is conducive to good implementation. And that reflection document that we've just been talking about is part of that, getting you to think about, in your school, in your context, are you in a good place to make embedded change in routines and practices that is going to make a lasting difference to the outcomes for disadvantaged children. So that draws to the end of the session today, and John's just going to explain a few more things before we go.
Thanks, Alistair. So yeah, thank you for working through that module with us. It's the point at which we're sort of telling you what comes next. So Alistair's talked through a gap task we'd like you to undertake, and then the next time we will see you, we will actually see you at the next time, will be the module 2, which we are doing via remote delivery on the 31st of January. And that will be Alistair and myself again between 3 and 5. We'll make sure you get a link to that via ROSIS in good time. And the other thing we'll do is that we'll make sure we've got the 3rd module for self-study available to go out immediately after that, so that those of you that want to organise yourselves to do that in early February are able to do so. Just one reflection as we were presenting this afternoon. All of you will have published recently your pupil premium strategy on the new template that the government have asked us to do. And for all of you, that will have involved a bunch of work that you probably could have done without, with everything else going on. But I just do want to reassure you that this program is not about ripping up all of that work that you've just done and you've just published. You know, I really hope you've come away already with a sense that this genuinely is a process, not an event. And that when you look at the structure of the modules and reflect on that the implementation cycle, you can see that this is going to be a process that takes you through from diagnosing need to a plan, and the timeline that we're working towards for many of you will fit really nicely with what would probably be a natural review of your pupil premium strategy towards the end of this academic year anyway. But we certainly don't want anyone under the impression that, you know, just done a lot of work on this and we're ripping it up. That's absolutely not the case. Your pupil premium strategy is a live document anyway, and what we're doing is just supporting a really in-depth view, in-depth look at exploring disadvantage in your schools. So thank you very much for working through this module with us, and we really look forward to seeing you all in person on the 31st of January. Thank you very much.